Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. I wanted to just quickly give an introduction on the Arts Council's behalf. We are incredibly excited to be a part of the Gentilly Resilience District work and are grateful to the city for really appreciating the role of artists, both young artists and established professional artists, in thinking about our city's relationship with water, how we can be more sustainable as a community, and to really think about how public art can create a deeper and different kind of shared understanding of these really complex topics that relate both to environmental resilience, but also to our community's sense of well-being. And so we're just really thrilled to be supporting a group of artists in learning about these issues from experts and community members, as well as residents, and hearing about what people in St. Anthony and Gentilly are interested in seeing out of their public spaces. And so we have a mix of people on the call. We have some of our Arts Council staff who are joining. We also have several of our artists who are part of our Civic Arts Fellowship, and those artists will be submitting proposals for public art for the Gentilly Resilience District in the coming weeks. And so they're eager to learn more about these issues and also to connect with residents who are engaged and excited about the topics. And then we also have several young artists from our Young Artist Movement program over at the Net Gentilly High School. And they have been working with Carl Joe Williams on 2 sculptures that will be installed in the rain garden on Nora's property and the Levee Breach site. And so they're still in the midst of finalizing their public art designs and are excited to learn from the topic of discussion today to contribute to that. So thank you all so much for joining us and being part of this conversation.
Thanks, Sarah. And I just want to let everyone know that we are currently recording this so that we can share the recording with people who can't make either this Water City tour or the one on Tuesday. And just want to make sure everyone knows that we're doing so. And then we'll be able to share out the link after the event as well. Along with, I think with Zoom, it's pretty easy to get a transcript of what we enter into the chat box. And so there'll be a way in which we can continue to share information, ideas, and resources both during and after the event. A couple of things. I think most of you have this down already, but in general, keep yourself on mute so that we don't get a lot of background noise while we're going. And then encourage everyone to use the chat box as a way to ask questions, to share reflections and stories and ideas and information that we only have another 15 minutes with together. And so there's only so much that we can communicate verbally. And one of the nice things about using Zoom is our ability to use chat. So what we're going to do as a way to introduce ourselves to each other and to get our heads into this space of Water City is we're going to have a quick opening discussion. Not verbally though, we're going to ask each of you to very briefly use the chat box to introduce yourself, just your name, something you want to share about yourself in relation to your role on the Gentilly Resilience District, or if you're a resident or an artist, and a quick thought on this question: in what ways is New Orleans a water city? So we'll just take 2 minutes to do that real quick. Again, use the chat box and we'll dive into it. So in what ways is New Orleans a water city? There's no right way or wrong way to answer that question. So whatever comes to mind. Hi, Scott. I know you just joined. We're asking everyone for the next minute and a half to use a chat box to briefly introduce themselves in terms of their relationship to St. Anthony, to the public art process, and or to the Gentilly Resilience District, and also to enter a thought into chat: in what ways is New Orleans a water city? Thanks. And what we'll do is I'll just read out some of these answers as they roll in. Sarah, says we have a physical, emotional, and spiritual connection to water. Robert Lloyd, water is New Orleans' reason for being, one of its greatest and somewhat untapped assets and one of its greatest challenges. Daryl, this is a water city because we are around water. Jenny Snape is an engineer with St. Anthony Green Street's project. New Orleans was founded because of its relation to water. Hi, I know somebody's just joined by phone. So if you can't see what's on the screen, what we're doing is we're using this first minute to, everyone's introducing themselves via chat, just sharing their name and their role in relation to the Resilience District or the St. Anthony neighborhood, and answering the question, in what ways is New Orleans a water city? Ashley, who is one of the artists, says, is a water city in its very intimate relationship with the Gulf and the Mississippi River. Gabrielle, I think New Orleans is a water city due to the physical placement of water around the city. These are fantastic. Thanks, everyone. Let's take another 30 seconds for people who are still typing. Stephanie Dreyer is a project manager for the St. Anthony Green Streets project, and she shares 2/3 of the US drains through New Orleans. Its past, present, and future is intertwined with the great Mississippi River. Absolutely. All right. Heidi, who is with the Arts Council, says New Orleans is a port city, river city, lake city, coastal city, canal city, sinking city, and so many other ways that we're a water city. Wonderful. Sly, I see that you just joined. We're using the chat box to briefly introduce ourselves and our role in relation to the Gentilly Resilience District, and sharing our thoughts on this question: in what ways is New Orleans a water city?
Yeah, it was good, y'all. I mean, it's in many ways, we deal with water every day, a lot of the cities like below sea level, and we have a very direct relationship to the Mississippi River. Our industry relies on a lot of port and goods that come from other places. And, clearly, the climate here kind of is always humid, raining a lot of the time. Just a lot of small things that make water a major part of New Orleans in everyday life. So, yeah.
Absolutely. Thanks, Sly. And Sly, if you could, can you also just type into chat your role into the chat box? Can you share what your role with the arts project is?
Yeah,
would love for everyone to be able to see that. Nathan Lott, formerly with the Water Collaborative, now with the Preservation Resource Center. He adds to Heidi's list. I would add floating city. At least that is our aspiration, that we will be able to float in the 21st century. Great, thank you all so much. Of course, I didn't get to everyone's response, and if you're still typing, that's totally fine. We're gonna dive into the content. So I love showing this image. It's an image from NASA, and I think it becomes evident when you look at this satellite view how absolutely fluid this landscape is. And so when we look at this patch of gray in the middle of the frame, that's New Orleans, that's greater New Orleans. We see Metairie, we see Orleans Parish, we see St. Bernard. And so we're really this patch of gray, hard concrete and asphalt Up here, we've got a similar gray patch that is Baton Rouge. And so we create these hard landscapes in the midst of a delta that's actually constantly flowing and shifting, because as so many of you noted, the river has constantly been depositing soil, and that soil is soft and unstable. And it's that interaction between land and water that makes this place such an amazing place to live, for commerce, for recreation, for all the things that we hold to be important here. The tour we're going to take starts up here in St. Anthony, the St. Anthony neighborhood of Gentilly, which is where the Gentilly Resilience District is happening. And what we're going to do is we're going to make 8 stops. And at each stop, unfortunately, we don't have 6 hours with you on a bus. So instead, we have 45 minutes. And so we'll spend, I'll talk for a minute or two at each of the stops just to share some basics about why I think that particular location is important. And through this conversation, through what we share with each other at each of these stops, the goal is for us to expand our understandings of the ways in which water has shaped the city, the ways in which it shapes our lives day to day, and also the ways in which it might influence how we think about the future and how we think about resilience projects within our levee system. So we're going to do a loop from St. Anthony. We're going to head up to Old Spanish Fort and to the lakefront. And then from there, we're going to drive on out over I-10 through Metairie and Kenner and head over to the river parishes into Norco and the Bonnie Carey Spillway. And we're going to make a loop back around on River Road, follow the Mississippi River all the way back to the Carrollton Water Treatment Plant, where we draw the very dirty water out of the Mississippi, make it very clean, and pump it from there out to all of our homes and businesses. And from there, we'll loop our way back via Bayou St. John and the high ground of the city, all the way back into Gentilly and the St. Anthony neighborhood. Okay, so our first stop, and this is just to remind everyone of the St. Anthony context. These are images from a series of events back in March of 2019. On the left is Gatto Playground. And so the St. Anthony Green Streets project will transform this along with Fillmore Playground. And in both cases, the parks will be rebuilt to handle stormwater coming from the streets and falling on the park itself. And on the right, we created these viewing boxes where residents could look through and see what was proposed for the parks and for the streets. So there are 2 streets in the St. Anthony neighborhood that are going to be rebuilt with green infrastructure to absorb stormwater that hits the asphalt surfaces of our roadways. During that time in March, we also did a series of walking tours. So on the left is OG Alexander from Home by Hand talking about some of the innovations that they've been incorporating into single family homes in terms of raising homes, in terms of pervious paving on driveways, and also building rain gardens on these residential properties. And on the right, Deb Abibu, who is a St. Anthony resident, we're at the site of the London Avenue Canal levee breach back in 2005. The canal, the flood wall behind her failed and was one of the primary sources of flooding for the neighborhood. And so in that context, we were able to talk about the relationship between urban water management, coastal restoration, and how all of these different parts and pieces are connected. And so one of the goals of today's tour is to really help strengthen our understanding of how our work inside the levees connects to what's happening outside of the levees. Back in January, we had a wonderful little tour with many of the artists who are on the call today. One of the stops, and also a handful of neighborhood residents. One of the stops that I think was really special was spending an hour or so with General Superintendent Bob Turner of the Sewage and Water Board at Drainage Pump Station 4. And so the image on the left, you can see we're kind of amidst the tangle of machines and piping and generators and vacuum pumps and all the devices that are necessary to lift water from this low-lying neighborhood that's below sea level up and over into the London Avenue outfall canal, which is visible on the right. And from there, I'm going to be annotating from there. So water flows this way, up and over, and then out to the lake via the outfall canal. Okay, so let's get on with the tour then. So from St. Anthony neighborhood, we would have hopped on the bus, and the first stop would have been Old Spanish Fort. So we're looking downriver really, and on the left, you will see the lakefront that we all know. If you go up to a lakefront today, there's a massive earthen levee that you climb over. And Spanish Fort is right here. So where I'm placing the star. And so this is Bayou St. John, right here. And so water flows in and out with the tides. It's connected to Lake Pontchartrain, which is connected to the Gulf of Mexico. And so water is flowing in and out. And there's a floodgate here that closes. It's generally kept closed, but it's closed so that to prevent storm surge coming from the Gulf of Mexico from entering into the city. I want you guys to keep in mind this line. That's the earthen levee. And that is the perimeter. When we talk about New Orleans being a bowl, this is the outer edge of that bowl. This is an artificial landscape that was put in place in the 1930s as a way to protect the city from storm surge coming in this way. On the bottom right, you can see an image from 1936. That's a model where we, as a city, actually created new land and built up that edge. So that's a Lake Vista neighborhood, and all that was pulled out of the bottom of the lake and piled up to create a new neighborhood and a new edge for the city. So Spanish Fort, this is what it looks like on the ground. This is where the bayou, it's a really bucolic setting where the bayou meets the lake. And Spanish Fort is called Spanish Fort because back in 1701, the initial French colonizers built this fort up as a location of strategic importance. Bayou St. John was one of the primary entries into the city of New Orleans. And so they actually used the oyster shell midden. So this was one of the locations where Native American settlements deposited oyster shells, forming even higher ground, and used that more stable high ground as a foundation for wooden palisades. And then over time, the French fort was replaced by a Spanish fort. In the 19th century, this became a spot for lakefront entertainment. Imagine on a hot summer day, if you didn't have air conditioning, the lakefront, you had the breeze coming off the water. And so people would ride out all the way to the lakefront to listen to music, to ride carousels. It became, by the 20th century, was known actually as the Coney Island of the South. And so you can imagine this location going from a military fort to a lakefront amusement park. Now you can still go out to that location and visit. You can kind of climb around on this fort. It's a bit of a strange ruin, right? I'm gonna go back to the location so you can see it. And what I want to point out is that if Spanish Fort is over here, the lakefront used to be in line, the fort was right at the edge of the city. And so everything beyond that was new land. So this seawall was constructed and then dirt was pulled from the bottom of the lake and piled up and dropped behind the seawall to create this artificial high ground. So we changed the very shape of the city in the 1930s to create high ground, to protect from storm surge, and also to create more developable land upon which to build new houses and to build entirely new neighborhoods. So I'm going to talk about the Lake Pontchartrain seawall, and then we'll pause briefly for questions. And again, feel free to use a chat box to share thoughts and ideas and stories that you might have about Spanish Fort. Unfortunately, we don't have a ton of time for in-person dialogue, but use a chat box as a way to share with your fellow participants. So this is an image also from earlier in the 20th century. This is the seawall that we're all familiar with, that to this day we can see. And like I mentioned earlier, soil was dredged from the bottom of Lake Pontchartrain and deposited behind the seawall to create that high ground. And it's hard for us to imagine today because the only condition we've known is that concrete seawall. But before then, this was the old Hammond Highway. The lakefront was a tidal condition. The land graded gradually. All these neighborhoods weren't below sea level. So places like Lakeview and Gentilly and Metairie that are all now 4, 5, 6 feet below sea level, those were above sea level, and that land graded into what was Lake Pontchartrain. And so you could see how radically different of a condition this is, where water could flow back and forth. And that water continues to act. It's still a tidal condition. And to this day, that water is constantly eroding away and working away at that seawall. So if you've been to the lakefront, you'll know there are always repairs that are seemingly always happening. All right, moving along, we'll go New Basin Canal, and this will be a quick stop. This is a view from 1915, looking back towards the middle of the city, and so we're looking from the lake inwards. And the New Basin Canal, you can see how massive, if you can imagine a waterway this big, and ships being able to move in and out of this environment and unloading goods. And it's called the New Basin Canal because there was the Old Basin Canal along what is now the Lafitte Greenway. And that the New Basin Canal was dug as a competitor to the Old Basin Canal. And so this provided water access into the heart of the city, almost right into the middle of the CBD from the lakefront. And so next time you're on Weston Boulevard in Lakeview, this massive neutral ground, the reason that there is such a massive neutral ground is that that's really the footprint of a former canal. So hopefully that gives some sense of some of the ways in which not even 110 years ago, we had a radically different landscape. There were canals threading their way through the city. You had boats tying up at the lakefront, but also coming into the heart of the city. And then the ways in which at the same time we were building out the city's drainage pump stations, really starting with the wood screw pump, which is patented, I believe, in 1918. The decades that followed that was this time of massive expansion out into Lake Pontchartrain and a massive expansion of the drainage infrastructure that we know today. If you're ever in a car heading out towards Baton Rouge and you're driving along I-10, next time that you do that, sorry, let me use a thicker line. Next time you do that, really pay attention to this edge. And the reason I say that is because as you go as you cross over, you're crossing from one side. So when you're driving in Kenner, you've got the airport on your left. You are in a landscape that is 7 or 8 feet below sea level. And then when you cross over, you're in a wetland. This is the LaBranche wetlands on the left. You're entering into a condition that's a little more similar to what would have existed before in Metairie and in Kenner. And so I think it's really hard in the highway to register how abrupt of a shift that is. But the reason this is important to pay attention to is that we created and how we've managed our stormwater by constantly pumping water out in order for us to build homes and create these suburban neighborhoods. We've sunken the ground and we've created this landscape where now we have parts of the city that are that low, surrounded by high walls, concrete flood walls built on top of levees. And then we have what's on the outside, which is just at or above sea level. So we're gonna make our way through the LaBranche wetlands, which are going to struggle in the years ahead. They're already highly degraded, and as almost all wetland areas in Southeast Louisiana are. But with sea level rise, they're unprotected from the rising seas. And so as the seas rise, it'll push more and more salt water into these already really damaged wetlands. When you're making that drive out to Baton Rouge, you can see all the dead cypress trees on either side of you. So Bonnie Carey Spillway, this is an aerial view looking upriver. And this is where we're gonna spend a little bit of time. So this is the town of Monts, the town of Norco. And this is a spillway. I'm gonna draw the outlines of it so we can all read this map together. And what it does is, as water comes downriver, so New Orleans is this way. I'm drawing the second arrow. So water is coming from upriver, and as snow melts in the upper Midwest, and that water flows from the Missouri and Minnesota down into via the Mississippi through Louisiana and down past New Orleans, when that water gets really high, it exerts a lot of pressure on the river levees. So after the 1927 flood, the decision was made to really reinforce and channelize the river as much as possible, to build up the levees on either side of the river to prevent a big flood like what we saw in 1927. You can imagine if you're channeling all that water and there's no way for it to escape, it actually builds up and flows faster. And so there are a couple of structures up and down the Mississippi. This is the one closest to us, and it's maybe a 30-minute drive. So Bonnie Carey Spillway is actually this line. And what it does is it allows water, when it gets really high and is threatening the levees and communities downriver, it's essentially a release valve that allows water to flow through this unpopulated area and into Lake Pontchartrain. And again, this is something that you drive past every time you're on I-10 going up towards Baton Rouge. You'll see the railroad trestles on your left here. And beyond that, you'll see this kind of scrubby landscape. So people drive ATVs, they fly gliders and drones and all kinds of, and then you'll see the different pits for where soils are excavated. I think it's also worth noting that I'm going to share a link that the spillway was constructed on top of 2 or more African-American burial grounds. And so after a flood in 1975, there were actually human bones that floated up. I'm going to share via chat an article that covers that a bit. I'm going to stop here. Any questions about how the spillway works? Feel free to speak directly or type it into chat. So this is looking downriver at the spillway. Sorry about that. And you can see the way it works is there are these little cranes. Well, they're not that little, just this structure is so massive that these cranes look tiny. And what they do is they roll along, and then starting from this end and going this way, they pull up these wooden pins and create gaps in this massive concrete structure so that water, the high water, has an overflow. And by letting this massive amount of water out, it reduces the pressure on the levees and on the levees next to New Orleans, protecting New Orleans as that water continues to flow downstream. So when you drive up to Bonnie Carey Spillway, this is a view back in October. And you can see this is a river on the left and the spillway is to our right. You can see all this activity. After last year's historic flooding, all that water, we've been talking about how the Mississippi River builds land. The river carries an immense amount of soil, sediment that's eroded up north. And as it comes down, when it flows into and through the spillway, that water starts to slow down. And as it slows down, it starts to deposit hundreds of thousands and millions of cubic feet of fresh soil. And so this is soil that's being excavated out of the spillway forebay and taken to construction sites and other industrial uses. This is the Lake Pontchartrain side of the spillway. Just want to give you a sense of how massive this thing is. Each of these is one of the wooden pins that's pulled out. So right now the spillway is closed. And so as that water comes through, it lands in this concrete trough. And these concrete pieces that look almost like anti-tank devices, it helps absorb the energy. All that flowing water is incredibly powerful and carrying in that water, not just sediments, but all kinds of fish and plant seeds and anything and everything that's already in the river. The pollutants from upstream, all of that comes rushing through and heading out through this low flat area and out to Lake Pontchartrain. And the impact of that is so big that from aerial imagery, whenever the spillway is open, you can see this plume of sediment or organic materials dumped by the river into Lake Pontchartrain. All right, River Road. Thanks. If you haven't been following along, Scott Eustace, Nathan Lott, and Robert Lloyd have been sharing additional content in the chat box. And I just shared a link to the anti-gravity article about the buried history, the sacred ground, the spillway. I accidentally shared that to just Stephanie Dreyer instead of to everyone. My apologies. All right, River Road. So as we head back along River Road, this landscape always blows me away. This is just straight out of Google Maps. This is Norco. And this is directly next to the spillway. And it's an interesting history. I think we could have 10 webinars just on this topic alone of River Road. And I'm only going to juxtapose two images. One is, so we know this space along the Mississippi River as Cancer Alley as well. Some people, there are activists who are using the phrase Death Alley. There are a significant number of oil and gas industries and refineries and chemical plants and fertilizer plants that exist up and down this corridor because of the access to natural resources that are extracted from the Gulf and the wetlands, and this being a place where you can both take in and process those natural resources and then also ship that to the rest of the world and also upriver. For example, fertilizers that are then used on fields in the in the Midwest, and some of that will flow back into the river and back down through here and create the algae bloom. And so this is an undeniable fact of life along River Road. And I would just contrast that with the more bucolic marketing of the plantation tours that also highlight River Road in a more nostalgic way because of this long history of plantations and extraction and violence that has been a part of these communities for hundreds of years now. And so a lot of small towns that exist along River Road, places like Mons and Norco, were started and inhabited by descendants of enslaved people who worked in these plantations. And so that's something to keep in mind when we think about the next time you're on River Road coming back from the spillway. I would just note too that the spillway has been opened 4 times already, once this year, twice last year, and once the year before that. Skip 1 year and it was open back in 2016 as well. And just keep in mind that in the past, we've gone 15, 20, 28 years in a row without having to open the spillway. So when we think about climate change and changes in weather patterns and the impacts of flooding and rainfall upstream, we're seeing an unprecedented amount of pressure on these flood infrastructure systems that we've put in place to keep New Orleans safe. Okay, so our second to last stop as we head downriver, again, we are following, this is the spillway. We're coming along River Road. We're coming all the way up to Oak Street. Some great bakeries and restaurants along there. And so we're at Carrollton. And when you get to Carrollton, the next time you are on that bike path next to the river levee, you can keep an eye out for this spot, which is where the entire east bank of New Orleans, where we draw our drinking water from. So imagine we've got a big pipe that sticks its mouth into the river and is constantly sipping from the river. So all of that water that is polluted and filled with sediments and chemicals and fertilizer and all kinds of stuff that's flowing downstream, but that's also our only source of drinking water. What happens to that water? When we pull it in, that water is deposited into these massive tanks where different chemicals are dropped in to cause coagulation. So again, think back to those sediments that were deposited at the Bonnie Carey spillway and think about chemicals that help these different particles bind to each other to form larger clumps. And the reason you do that is the water flows through a series of settling tanks, and tanks, the water gets sequentially clearer and clearer because those coagulated components, as they grow bigger, they actually become heavier and they drop out. So think about if you're shaking up a jar that's full of sediment and water that's all mixed up, the heaviest pieces, if you got big rocks and pebbles, they're gonna fall out first. They're heavier. And so when water is not in motion, they won't stay suspended. They'll drop to the bottom. The finer grain particles need more time. So that water is moving almost imperceptibly through thousands of feet of these settling tanks. And over time, that water gets to be clean enough that chlorine is added, and then it goes through in these filtration galleries on the right. It's this beautiful landscape where each of these squares is actually a deep, thick layer of sand and anthracite, and that water is barely moving. It's just soaking slowly over the course of many hours and days through these layers of sand and anthracite. And that's the final stage of polishing to get the water to a point where you drink it. The water that comes out of the Carrollton water purification plant is really good. It's really clean. Some of the water quality issues that we have really have to do with the pipes. So we're gonna just share this image on the left of water mains. So this is actually a hollowed out cypress log, and that for early parts of the city's history, wooden pipes were actually one of the ways in which water was distributed to the rest of the city. That was replaced by cast iron, and now increasingly we're using plastic pipes. But this technology is constantly changing, but it's a slow and expensive process to upgrade infrastructure over time. And so a lot of the water issues we're facing today relate back to the deferred maintenance on existing systems and the need to put in place newer systems. Oh, the water tanks, I'll just point out real quick, those towers that you see in these images. So in the previous one, the water towers, these two were added after, in the last 2 or 3 years in order to help with boil water advisories. So basically water that's clean is pushed up into these water towers. And when there's a loss of water pressure, the Sewage and Water Board now has a capacity to release all of this water from up high to maintain water pressure for, I think, like 45 seconds to a minute, something like that, long enough for power systems to turn back on. So the whole point of these water towers is to help prevent boil water advisories. So water, if the river is down here, the water comes up through here and it cycles back and forth. It's kind of like if you think about a diagram of your intestines. It's essentially a system, or you can think about it as a lazy river. It's moving that water through as slowly as possible. And again, you can see that. And then this area, these are the filtration galleries. That's that last step. And then once it goes through those sand filters, it gets pumped up to the water towers, to the storage tanks that you can see along Claiborne. And those then become the water sources that get water out to our homes. All right, so you can see a little bit. It's not quite as clear. If you look in Google, you can see amazingly how that water becomes clearer and clearer as it goes through this sequence. Okay, so we have about 10 minutes. I'm gonna wrap up with Bayou St. John, and then we'll open it up for a few questions and dialogue. I'll be happy to stay on longer, but we are coming up on our 1 hour mark. So Bayou St. John, this is the only image I'll show. I think we're all familiar with Bayou St. John, but I return here because as we loop our way back to Gentilly, Bayou St. John is the very reason why New Orleans is situated where it's situated. So drawing upon Native American knowledge of high ground and the ways in which these different waterways were connected, there were settlements. People had always lived and traded along the high ground of the Metairie Ridge and Bayou St. John. I will note real quick This is not something you would assume or necessarily pay attention to, but you can see even in this image how Bayou St. John is actually higher than the neighborhood. So Bayou St. John is higher, so it doesn't provide any drainage capacity for the surrounding neighborhood. Bayou St. John is a ridge. If you look back to pictures from after Katrina, there are pictures of people, this is next to American Can Company, people being evacuated by helicopters on this spot because the high ground bayous and rivers, just like along the French Quarter, along River Road, the high ground is always next to the water. So unlike in most of the rest of the world, in our Delta context, high ground is next to the water. So the river the city is situated where it is today is because the bayou provided, if you think back to the lakefront, it provided a connection from Lake Pontchartrain and the Gulf of Mexico. You could come in by boat via Bayou St. John and get really close to the river again. And what the Native Americans showed was that with a short portage route, you could connect overland from Bayou St. John to the Mississippi River, and that was a far easier route to navigate than trying to make your way through the always shifting Bird's Foot Delta. So my closing question for everyone is, I encourage you to respond via chat, but also using your voices. Just remember to unmute yourself. Is this question: how might thinking about New Orleans as a water city change how we think about neighborhood resilience? How might thinking about New Orleans as a water city, and this is everything, where do we get our drinking water from? What is the history of the river creating this land? What is the history of living along the lake, spending time for recreational purposes along the lake? Lincoln Beach, Pontchartrain Beach, Old Spanish Fort, the Coney Island in the south. How do we think about our relationship to the river, to the Gulf, and to Lake Pontchartrain, and to these bayous? How do those relationships that are so much bigger than just what we're trying to do with the Gentilly Resilience District, how do those things inform how we think about neighborhood resilience? All right. Get to live with water, embrace it, love it, expect it. Yeah, what are some thoughts, questions? Natalie, I think you're muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay, great. I was actually going to speak to that point, you know, with the effects of climate change. And I think Sarah spoke to this early on in our chat conversation when she said, what a great day to be having this conversation. But with the effects of climate change becoming more and more apparent, the water is coming, whether we like it or not, and more of it is coming. So, I mean, I think one of the things that I try to impress upon individuals when I do my work with community outreach is trying to change the minds of New Orleanians when it comes to water. We traditionally kind of have an adverse relationship with water. I think we're more concerned with getting rid of it or being at war with it as opposed to adapting to it and living with it. And I think this is an opportunity with, you know, these new fresh initiatives around green infrastructure and about using the natural environment to kind of not necessarily stave off the water, but learn to live with it. I think the better attitude we have and relationship that we have with water, I think the more resilient and sustainable our communities will become. But, you know, I think it all depends on how we view it and the context in which we interact with it.
Thanks, Natalie. Love to hear from some of the NET students, if you guys are willing to share. Yeah, I really encourage everyone to type their thoughts or or share, we've got 6 minutes, and would love to hear from the artists, the professional artists, the young ones. Yeah, whoever's on the line.
Well, I'll jump in. As you were talking, I was really struck by how much of our history is around finding ways to control water. And then as things shift and change, thinking about new ways to try and control the water, and then things shift again and we try and control it in a different way. And it just feels like as things are really rapidly, shifting in response to climate change, that, it's not going to cut it. And we have to really think about, different ways of embracing it and thinking about natural systems and not just trying to, control the environment that we have around us.
Thanks.
I'm sorry, Gabrielle. Go ahead, baby. I'm sorry.
Adding on to Sarah's point, I think we should look at our relationship with water more so as like a partnership rather than something that we have to control. Because I feel like the more that we try to control it, the more we can't. And with everything changing so much and so fast, if we just keep looking at it at a standpoint of like, okay, this is how we control it, it's gonna be a lot harder to live with it because that keeps changing.
Thanks. What's one way in which, when you say partnership, what's something that comes to mind? What might that look like, do you think? And that's for you, Gabrielle, and anyone else who has thoughts on that.
I guess something as simple as like the rain gardens, like it's something that we can still enjoy, but it serves the purpose of both us humans and the nature. So it's protecting everybody. So it's protecting everybody.
I also think we can start thinking about our built environment as well as our natural urban landscape. How we build things instead of building things that are like on flat, impermeable surfaces. Maybe start thinking about one of the comments in the text chat. I think it may have been Nathan that mentioned something about floating cities. And I was watching a documentary about sinking cities, and it talked a lot about aquitecture, which is like architecture mixed with the ability for dwellings to be amphibious and basically float on water. So maybe think about our built environment as well.
Yeah.
Do you have the name of that documentary?
It comes on PBS and it's called Sinking Cities, and they follow different cities, Tokyo, Miami, London. It's really interesting. I would advise you check it out.
Thank you.
Carl Joe Williams, I see that you are unmuted. What would you like to share?
I was just thinking that, the whole process, it was about, one thing that kept coming up was trying to figure out ways to be more in harmony with water, and understanding that water is such an important part of New Orleans. It's more important to, like in this project specifically, like make work that actually kind of propels a new mindset about how we live water and what our future is going to be, in terms of how we manage it. So for me, the word is harmony, like trying to figure out how to harmonize.
Yeah. Carl and students, Shanti, Sly, I'm curious, maybe in our last minute or two, what are some of the ways in which things we've talked about today relate to the art project you guys are working on?
Before the students chime in, I just wanted to go back to the comment about thinking about the built environment. Thinking about water and just, seeing a lot of the recent developments that are happening around the city, I think there's such an interesting connection between, we're a sinking city, but yet we continue to develop like huge, you know, multi-tier skyscrapers and buildings. And how is that like, there, I haven't seen any connection around what that does to, you know, our placement with, you know, ocean levels or flooding. So that, I just think that's a really interesting point to kind of explore. And then from the presentation, I thought what was really interesting is talking about a lot of, like, from the flood in the 1920s, a lot of our strategies around dealing with water are results from that. So thinking we're dealing with systems that were created 100 years ago that are continuing in some capacity to provide us safety, and what does that do for us now in creating systems that can support the future? You know, oftentimes I think the challenge around getting support for environmental issues is that people say, well, I'm not going to be around in 100 years to, you know, manage this. But again, the past took care of us, and so we sort of have this responsibility to build in systems for the future.
Thanks, Lindsay. Last chance to share some thoughts. Again, I'll stay on the line for another 10-15 minutes, but any last comments you want to get on the record?
I think for the YAM project, we've been focusing a lot on like educating the people in the spaces, because like you were saying, these are things that like we don't typically think about, and when we do, we try to be like, well, that's not my problem because I won't be here whenever they become an issue, really. So I feel like we have been really focusing on our pieces, trying to like educate and show that we have a responsibility within helping to change this.
And I think it's also important to know that there may be a 100-year effect and issue, but there's also a shorter term effect and issue that we can all still be here for. We can also be here for the 5-year repercussions and the 10-year repercussions of our actions as well. So not thinking about sustainability as something that's going to happen after our lifetime, but sustainability efforts that will affect us in our lifetime.
We've had some wonderful comments from Robert, from Stephanie Dreyer, and Ashley. Thank you for sharing your thoughts. And I would encourage you, as you close out of this conversation, if you have anything, any questions, anything that's on your mind for the project you're working on, or something you're thinking about, or something that you're left with, just type it into chat, and we'll find ways to follow up. And for folks that you know that may have wanted to join today, we'll be doing this Water City tour again next Tuesday, and because it'll be the second time around, it'll probably be even better, hopefully. So just, it'll be the same Zoom link, same content, but with a different group of people. So everyone is welcome to join again, but definitely share it with folks in the neighborhood, your colleagues, your friends, your family members. I think this stuff, the water we drink, the way the city was created, the future of the lake, of the bayou, all that pertains to all of us who live here. Great. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Aaron, and to the Water Leaders Institute for helping to put this on, and also to the City of New Orleans for this really incredible and complex work in thinking about, you know, systems change and infrastructure change, and also seeing the value of the arts and culture and creativity and all of that.
All right. Great. Thank you all. Again, I'll stay on for a few minutes, and but otherwise I will see everyone either next Tuesday or at one of the future Arts Council events for this process.
We're at the Fika tonight.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, Jenny. Bye, Scott. Brooklyn, you're killing it. All right, I'm going to stop the recording.
Cool.